When the roar of the Vikings echoed over Northumbria, King Aella didn't even have a chance to repent. While he was torturing Ragnar, he didn't know what fate awaited him. The Vikings had assembled the largest army for revenge in their history. They headed straight for the kingdom of Northumbria. Soon the news of the Vikings' landing reached Aella, and the person who delivered the message was kicked out by him. Before leaving, he boasted to his daughters that he had made adequate preparations. He assured them he would give a special welcome ceremony to Ragnar's sons. Aella set off with his troops, accompanied by the bishop. Full of confidence, he stood on the hilltop. A look of triumph crossed his face when he saw the Viking troops. The number of Viking warriors on the other side was small, but as the size of the Viking troop gradually expanded, Ella's attitude began to change. Before the bishop could answer, they saw Floki entering their sight, followed by countless Viking warriors. Their strong momentum marked the beginning of the battle. Upon seeing this, Aella instantly paled and gasped for air. The Herald brothers led their pirate group into the battlefield from the sides. The overwhelming pressure made it difficult for Aella to breathe, leaving him no choice but to pray. However, given the situation, even God could not save him now. As Ivar's chariot arrived in front of the battle, the Vikings' sharp blades had been unsheathed. Their eyes were filled with greed for blood. Ivar stopped in front of the battle line, and Bjorn and the others looked forward with bloodthirsty eyes. By now, the Viking army was officially lined up. The strength of both sides was simply incomparable. The momentum of the Vikings seemed capable of engulfing the English at any moment. They roared in rage, and the strong killing intent echoed in the valley. The Vikings blew the horn of revenge, and Bjorn was the first to charge into the enemy line. With a roar that shook the sky, the courageous Viking army rushed at the English soldiers behind him. Floki and Ivar were also infected by this atmosphere. At this moment, their bloodthirsty nature was undeniable, and all that awaited Aella was judgment. Unsurprisingly, the whole of Northumbria was eventually annihilated, and Aella was captured. Ivar dragged him all the way to where Ragnar died. Seeing the fierce sons of Ragnar, Aella was terrified. At this moment, he finally understood what Ragnar said, so he led them to the snake pit. When they opened the cold pit, Ragnar's bones were gone. At this point, Aella tried to save himself with money.
My father have to my weight on the gold and silver.
His previous arrogance had vanished. Floki nailed Aella to a stake, and then they prepared to administer the Blood Eagle punishment to Aella. Aella's screams echoed into the night sky. His blood seeped, drop by drop, into his own territory, under the gaze of Ragnar's sons. The next day, they hung Aella up.
How the little piggies will grunt when they hear the older boar suffer.
As soon as Bjorn's army attacked the kingdom of Northumbria, Kattegat was attacked by surprise. Even before the army had set out, Lagertha had implemented a high-alert security mode. Torvi took on the responsibility of defending the city and quickly noticed something unusual. There was a group of strangers. They had dressed as merchants and entered the city. This raised Torvi's suspicion. She learned from the shopkeepers that these people had been moving around the city but had not been making any trades. At the same time, the other party also discovered Torvi's actions. Fortunately, Lagertha was prepared, and they were defeated by Lagertha's shield girls as soon as they were exposed. However, Lagertha knew it wasn't that simple. The enemy was likely to have already found an opening in their defenses. Sure enough, not long after, they built many wooden boards, trying to launch a full frontal attack by crossing over the trenches. Lagertha personally led the team to climb onto the city wall to stop the invading enemies. Both sides fought fiercely at the city gate, but the real crisis was just beginning. At that moment, another force of enemies landed from the waterway near Kattegat's port. The main force defending the city was at the city wall at this point. They easily stormed into the city. The man leading the team was Egil. Although they encountered a small-scale blockage, they were quickly resolved by the opponent. Lagertha was forced to make adjustments and immediately mobilized her manpower to return to the city. Just as Egil was preparing to continue his attack, Lagertha stood in front of him. Facing the swarming enemies, she calmly threw the torch in her hand. Under Lagertha's leadership, the shield maidens quickly defeated the attackers. Egil was captured on the spot, but Torvi was critically wounded. Lagertha tied him to a rack, then started to roast him with fire. Yet, Egil remained silent. Then Lagertha captured his wife, but Egil directly stated that he did not know this person. His wife watched as her husband was tortured like this, her heart already crushed. All she could do was urge Egil to confess. Looking at his wife, he finally revealed that he was under Harold's orders. Bjorn and his brothers were on their way to Wessex, their next revenge target being King Ecbert. At this moment, Ethelwulf found King Ecbert and informed him that the Vikings were marching towards them. He told Ecbert that these men were coming to avenge the death of Ragnar. Ethelwulf said that King Ecbert was either manipulating him or humiliating him, using himself to fulfill Ecbert's ambitions. King Ecbert, as his father, took Judith away to become his mistress. They had even killed his only flesh and blood.
You loved Ethelstan, right? You love Ragnar Lothbrok. You love Judith. Right. You love me, Father. Do you? Because if you do, I want you to say so. I need you to say so. Please. Please.
Then, a soldier brought a critically injured man to King Ecbert. This man was the bishop of the kingdom of Northumbria. He told King Ecbert about the defeat of King Aella. Then King Ecbert arranged for Ethelwulf to lead his troops to block the Vikings. The only thing that offered some consolation was that the two sons he had raised for someone else were willing to go to war with their father. But Ethelwulf was reluctant to let them take risks. The next day, Ethelwulf said goodbye to everyone, one by one, then took his soldiers and set off. Ethelwulf rushed to the allied military camps in Wessex and Mercia without stopping. From the cheers of the soldiers, it was clear that Ethelwulf held high prestige among the army. He listened to the pre-battle reports from his soldiers in the tent. At this point, the Vikings had left Northumbria, and their ships had sailed into the inner river of Mercia. The fear of the Vikings had long been etched into the bones of the English. People along the way had no choice but to abandon their homes in a panic. However, the Vikings did not launch a direct attack this time. They rested at Repton in Mercia. Ragnar's sons began to argue over the command of the army again. Ragnar's great revenge had not been avenged, and several of his sons had conflicts. Floki couldn't stand this any longer.
So this is what the grunting of the little pigs was all about.
However, the internal strife of the Vikings was far from over. Harold was also trapped by feelings. The princess he admired was now married to another man. Watching their interactions, Harold couldn't accept it, so he approached the princess and declared his intentions.
You probably thought it was an impossible task you had set me in any case. I was never supposed to achieve it. You never really intended to marry me, did you?
I'm sorry.
But I'm glad that you have forgiven her.
Then Elisif surprisingly approached Harold to apologize. She expressed that she had always loved Harold. Elisif told Harold that she had never loved anyone else, and she should have waited for him. She hoped that Harold would accept her again, and the atmosphere in the tent began to grow ambiguous. Just then, Elisif suddenly pulled out a knife hidden behind her, ready to avenge her husband. However, just as she was about to make a move, she was killed by Halfdan. The revenge army continued to push into Wessex, but things didn't go smoothly for long. Scouts detected the English army led by Ethelwulf. Bjorn ordered to set up camp on the spot, and would fight in the name of Ragnar the next day.
Tomorrow we shall fight.
But Ivar had his own ideas. He wanted to check out the terrain and make necessary tactical adjustments before the battle began. After all, the English understood their fighting style to a certain extent, and the inherent shield wall mode wasn't suitable for such a large army anymore. So Bjorn agreed with his proposal and accompanied him to observe the terrain. The next day, both armies met in the Misty Valley. But what was very puzzling was that the Vikings turned around and left as soon as they saw the English troops. Ethelwulf hesitated for a moment and led his army in pursuit. But when he reached the top of the hill, the Vikings had mysteriously disappeared. At this time, the Vikings hid in the woods one after another. Just as Ethelwulf was puzzled, a team of Vikings suddenly appeared from their rear. Ethelwulf immediately ordered a chase, but by the time they got closer, the Vikings slipped away again. Just then, the Viking warriors hiding in the woods launched an attack on the English soldiers. The English alliance was instantly filled with death and injury. Ethelwulf hastily dismounted to organize a defense, but as soon as they had formed a defensive formation, the Vikings in the woods stopped firing. Ethelwulf, puzzled and filled with anger, held his sword ready to rush into the woods, but then a new situation arose. The Vikings again mysteriously appeared behind them, and Ethelwulf could only continue to lead the team in pursuit. But the Vikings disappeared again, and then they appeared behind the English soldiers once more. Ethelwulf began to fall into despair, but then he thought they could go directly to where the Vikings had landed. As long as they destroyed all their ships, they could gain the initiative. Seeing Ethelwulf's troops leaving, Floki had an incredulous look on his face. However, they were attacked by the Vikings halfway through. In an instant, Viking warriors surged out from all directions, the most brutal war on English soil and the most formidable army of revenge by the Vikings. The Vikings took revenge on England in the name of Ragnar. The soldiers of both sides mixed in a moment, and the Vikings once again revealed their bloodthirsty nature. Bjorn was no stranger to the brutality of war and showed no mercy to the English soldiers. His overwhelming combat power could be said to scorn everything, while Ecbert continued to wield his weapon. For Sigurd, being born with snake eyes seemed to be a curse. This battle could very well be his last. Ubbi was the most like Ragnar among the children, sometimes calm, sometimes arrogant. He had now become a frenzied warrior. Not only that, but the Viking camp also had the blessing of the Harald brothers. On the English side, it seemed that resistance was already starting to fade, with only Ethelwulf fighting alone. In the previous guerrilla warfare, the English were already exhausted. The gap between the two sides became more and more prominent, with the Allied forces completely entangled in tough battle. When Ethelwulf saw Ivar return with his troops, his fighting spirit was completely defeated, and he had no choice but to order a retreat. In this battle, the Vikings completely crushed the main English alliance. While everyone was cheering for victory, Bjorn remained exceptionally calm. Their revenge mission was not over yet. Ecbert was their final target. The defeated Ethelwulf led the remaining troops back to Wessex. He immediately reported their defeat to King Ecbert and urged everyone to pack up and leave quickly. He knew the Vikings wouldn't stop, but King Ecbert wasn't planning to leave. This made Ethelwulf very puzzled. After all, he was a monarch and should not fall into the hands of the Vikings. King Ecbert knew that he was the Vikings' target. If he left with the Vikings, they were bound to come after him, and the whole capital would be buried with him. So King Ecbert decided to pass the throne to Ethelwulf. After being authorized by the bishop, Ethelwulf officially became the legitimate king of Wessex and Mercia. After the ceremony, the new king ordered everyone in the city to withdraw from Wessex. The bishop and Ecbert saw everyone off together. During this time, Ecbert specifically warned Alfred to be a wise monarch. The bishop also decided to stay with Ecbert. After all, this was the place they had worked hard for their entire lives. After everyone left, Ecbert and the bishop calmly sat on the throne, waiting for fate's verdict. Not long after, the Viking troops arrived at Wessex. The gates of England's capital state were no match for the assault. But what was even more surprising was that there was no one in the city. Unable to contain themselves, the Harald brothers led their team into the city. After searching for a while, they found that it was indeed deserted. So they began to loot the supplies in the city and then set the buildings on fire. At this time, King Ecbert had grown somewhat impatient, so he ran out willingly to surrender. Ecbert was put into a cage, just as he had treated Ragnar before. At this time, Floki was indifferent to what was happening outside. The moment Ecbert killed the bishop, Floki seemed to feel a certain call. When Floki arrived, Helga was already on her last breath. She died after a brief farewell. Facing his wife's departure, Floki felt as though his body had been drained. Half a lifetime of war had become meaningless, and the gods had not favored him. So, he decided to leave on his own to wander in far-off places. At this point, several people disagreed about what to do with King Ecbert. Ivar thought they should execute him with the blood eagle punishment because he was the chief culprit in their father's death. However, his idea was opposed by his other brothers. They thought it was easy to kill King Ecbert, but besides revenge, they also had to think more rationally about what would benefit the Vikings the most. That was exactly what Ragnar wanted. He not only wanted to win the war, but also wanted to acquire this fertile land. At this time, they were in someone else's kingdom, and soon the enemy would gather a large army to encircle them. Just as everyone was in the heat of debate, King Ecbert interrupted their argument. He wanted to make a deal with Bjorn and the others. Just as they had discussed, it was only a matter of time before the Vikings were driven out of England because they didn't have legal land ownership. They couldn't stay. King Ecbert said he could give them the ownership of East Anglia. He told Bjorn that it was a large kingdom, and he was the king, so no one would question it. They had enough people to establish a city-state there. They seemed to be persuaded by Ecbert's words and said they would discuss it again. In the end, they came to an agreement. They wanted the land legally, but Ecbert had to die too. Ecbert didn't resist. He only hoped he could choose his own death. Then, Ecbert transferred a piece of land in Wessex to them in the name of the king. After signing the agreement, Ecbert came to his familiar pool, and this would be his final resting place.